Hey, this is Tony here with Salt Strong, and in this video we're going to be talking about what to look for when you're in a store buying a new spinning rod. Now there's a ton of brands out there, but we're not going to go into detail about specific brands or anything like that. We're not sponsored or endorsed by any brands. What I really want to do is just talk about what to visually inspect on these rods when you are purchasing them, so that you don't get home and go out and use it and then next thing you know it breaks or something's wrong with it, then you have to bring it back. So a few tips to help you out with that. Now, one of the first things that I always inspect when I purchase a new rod are the guides on the rod. I want to make sure those guides are nice and straight. You don't want any guides that are out of alignment. They should all be in a nice straight line, and they should also be lined up with the actual reel seat. So it's a good idea to bring whatever reel you're trying to put on your rod, bring it with you to the store. That way you can actually fit it on there and make sure it's nice and aligned. Because there are a few things when you do put your reel on that you want to take into consideration. And one thing being, you want the spool of your reel to be in line with that first guide. You don't want a really large reel with the spool, further down, and then it's not in line with your guide, because that is going to, one, put a lot of pressure on this guide because your line's now going to be sitting on the bottom of that guide instead of going right through the middle. Also, it will affect casting. When you go to cast, your line's going to be rubbing up against that guide. So again, make sure the spool of your reel is almost centered and angled straight towards the middle of that first guide. And then going back to actually having your reel centered on the reel seat. Sometimes a rod that may be a defect, the reel might be sitting a little bit off center and it's not going to be straight in line with the guides on your rod. So definitely make sure you check that out as well. Now, going back to inspecting the guides, one thing you definitely want to make sure none of the guides are bent. So again, make sure they're nice and straight, aligned on the spine of the rod, and also that they are not bent. And also you want to inspect the actual inserts in the guides. Make sure they're there, make sure they're not missing. I've bought some rods where it's usually either the very tip of the rod or one of the first 3 or 4 guides might have a guide missing or an insert missing in there. Definitely check that out. And another tip I want to share is bring a little cotton swab with you, a little Q-tip, because what you can do is basically run this through or around the inserts of the guides, and you can tell if one is cracked or not. If there's a little chip in there, it will grab that cotton immediately and start to pull on it. And when you have a cracked or chipped guide or an insert on your guide, you're going to lead to issues with your line breaking and your line becoming frayed very easily. So just a little tip there as far as checking your guides to make sure they're not cracked or chipped. Now, the last thing with the guides that I like to check is to make sure there's no cracks or gaps where the guide is placed on the actual rod itself. Sometimes if they were bent and then bent back into place, there might be a crack there or a little gap there. So definitely check that out, because obviously if there is a crack or a gap there, they're going to be weaker. That's going to allow for water to actually get inside, and it will start rusting out and corroding that piece that is actually wrapped onto the rod, which holds the guide on there. So definitely check that out. Now, when you actually physically inspect the rod itself, there are a few things you want to check. First thing is to make sure there's no nicks or cracks on the rod itself. A lot of these carbon and graphite rods, if they get a little nick on them or a chip, that makes a weak point, and that rod will pretty much crack almost immediately as soon as pressure is applied to it in that location. So definitely check that out. Go along the entire length of the rod. Again, you can use either a piece of cotton or just your fingertip and run it along the rod, visually inspect it, make sure there's no cracks or chips, because again, if there is, you're going to have a broken rod pretty much as soon as you go to cast a lure or a bait. And then one last thing I like to check out with the actual rod itself is to just make sure it is straight. Some rods, if they're stored and bent for a long time, they will actually take on that shape if they're definitely a lower end rod. So just make sure, do a visual inspection, look straight down the rod, sort of rotate it as you're looking down it, and you can get a good idea as to whether or not that rod is straight or if it has a defect in it. Now lastly, I just wanted to quickly talk about what I like to look for in a spinning rod as far as quality goes for an inshore spinning rod. What you're going to notice is that inshore spinning rods are typically going to be a little bit more expensive than, let's say, a freshwater rod because of the components it's made out of. You obviously want to have components that are either corrosion resistant or rust resistant because, again, you're going to be in the salt. So definitely have a rod that has corrosion resistant components such as stainless steel, titanium, aluminum, anything like that. Titanium is going to be the most corrosion resistant. Stainless steel would probably be next, even though stainless steel can get corrosion and rust on it. Just make sure you're taking care of your equipment, washing it down at the end of the day, and drying it off to extend the life of your rod. So really quick, just going back to actually pairing your reel with your rod. Again, I highly recommend bringing your reel with you. If not, you can just grab one that's at the store and just ask an employee, hey, can I use this reel really quick to try to pair it up with a rod? And if they don't have the exact reel, just go with the same size. So if it's a 3000 size reel, go find another reel that is a 3000 size, put it on the rod, and it should pretty much be the same. And again, you want to make sure that spool is pretty much facing directly towards that first guide on the rod. Now, one last thing are the guides on the rod, the spacing of the guides and also the size of the guides on your rod. I have two rods here and the guides are almost completely total opposites. So as you see here, I've got this blue rod, got the butts lined up. They're both 7'6" rods. As you can see on the blue rod, that guide starts sooner than the guide on the black rod here. It's actually closer to the reel. So what that's going to do, it's going to choke your line quicker. It's going to control those coils coming off your spool much quicker. So it's going to lead to a more effective cast as opposed to a guide that is very far from where your reel would be on your rod. Also, the size of the guides. As you can see, the size of these guides are different. I'll go ahead and line them up here. On that blue rod, you can see the guide is smaller. And then on this black rod here, you can see that guide is much larger. So again, it comes down to controlling your line. That larger guide is not going to choke your line as effectively as a smaller guide. So you're going to get a lot more line slap on this rod with a larger eye, and your line most likely is not going to cast as effectively because you want to get that line controlled as quickly as possible so that your lure or your bait can pull that line out more effectively. Now you may be asking, okay, what about the length of the rod? What about the action? That would be a different video. That is more of a personal preference, more of what you may be using the rod for, what type of lures, what type of bait, also what action you prefer. So we'll talk about that in a different video. In this video, I just wanted to go over some things to inspect on your rod when you are purchasing it so that you can find yourself an ideal quality rod when you're out there shopping for one. So if you have any questions or comments about this, or perhaps some additional tips you would like to share, definitely leave those down below. Until then, thanks for watching, and I'll see you on the next video.